Imagine, for a second, a room with absolutely no music playing. Just a room. A quiet, perfectly ordinary room that honestly hasn't changed a bit in years. You know the kind of place I'm talking about, right? The kind of room where time doesn't really move forward anymore, it just sort of settles. Think about the dust resting gently along the edges of an old, scratched wooden dresser. The curtains are drawn halfway, maybe a faded floral pattern, letting in just this one thin line of late afternoon light. It cuts across the hardwood floor like something fragile. Like something you instinctively feel shouldn't be disturbed. And tucked away inside that room, there's a drawer. It sticks a little when you pull on the brass handle. Not because the track is broken, but simply because it hasn't been opened in a very, very long time. The wood has swelled with years of summer humidity and winter cold. When it finally gives way, it does so slowly. Almost like it's reluctant to let you inside. If you look in, you'll find small things. Old things. A heavy metal watch that stopped ticking decades ago. A black and white photograph, curled and cracked right at the edges. A folded piece of cotton fabric that still carries the faint, dusty scent of something you can't quite put a name to anymore, maybe a mix of old cedar and dried aftershave. And then, tucked underneath it all, there's the letter. The paper is badly yellowed. It's so fragile it feels like it might literally crumble into flakes if you exhale too heavily near it. You can just tell, simply by looking at the way it rests there, that it has been handled countless times. Picked up, held, put back. But never, ever opened. The edges are worn soft. The fold lines are deeply creased from being pressed between a thumb and forefinger again and again, as if someone kept picking it up, weighing it in their hand, considering it, and then putting it back down in the dark. For years. For decades, even. 40 years, to be exact. Imagine holding it right now, right between your own fingers. There's a strange, undeniable weight to it. I don't mean a physical weight, paper is just paper, after all. It's something else entirely. Something much heavier. You turn the envelope over. There's no address written on the front. There's no postage stamp in the corner. There isn't a single sign that this envelope was ever meant to leave the quiet confines of the room it was kept in. There's just a name. Written out so carefully. So painstakingly slowly. It looks exactly like the handwriting of a person who didn't fully trust their own hand to stay steady. And when you finally pry it open, when the brittle paper unfolds with that soft, almost painful little tearing sound, you see the words. I'll be home by Christmas. That's all it takes, really. Just one sentence. One simple promise. And suddenly, that quiet room doesn't feel so quiet anymore. Because it hits you, this letter was never sent. It wasn't delayed by the post office. It wasn't lost in transit. It wasn't forgotten in the bottom of a duffel bag. It was kept. Hidden away. Carried around. For 40 years. By a man who physically came home, but who never, truly returned. Try to imagine him for a moment. I'm not talking about the version of him that everyone else saw. Not the guy in the framed photographs on the mantel, standing up straight, wearing a pressed uniform, smiling just enough to reassure his mother and his neighbors that everything was perfectly fine. No. Imagine the version of him that absolutely no one ever talked about. The man who sat completely alone in this very room, maybe listening to the hum of the refrigerator 2 rooms over. The man who opened this sticky drawer, again and again, year after year. Who picked up this flimsy envelope, felt the emotional gravity of it, read those 5 words in his own handwriting. And then quietly folded it back up. Carefully. Without making a sound. Like he was sealing something dangerous away. He wasn't just hiding the letter, you see. He was sealing away the moment it was written. Because something terrible happened in the gap between the writing of that hopeful sentence, and the actual life he came back to. Something happened that made those words completely impossible to put in a mailbox. Impossible to explain to a wife or a mother. Impossible to survive, twice. And so, he just didn't send it. He didn't speak a word of it. He never told a single soul what those specific words meant to him, or why they haunted him. Instead, he just carried the weight of it. In total silence. For 40 years of his life. Listen, maybe you've known someone like that. Someone who managed to live out an entire human life, without ever telling the one story that actually mattered the most. The kind of person who always laughed at the right punchlines. Who showed up to the Sunday barbecues and the graduation parties exactly when they were supposed to. Who said very little overall, but somehow, just by being in their presence, made you feel like there was an ocean of things they weren't saying. Something swimming just beneath the surface of the water. Something they had sworn to themselves they would never let you see. And now, standing here in this quiet room, holding a fragile letter that was frankly never meant for your eyes. You really start to feel it. That nagging question. The one that doesn't hit you all at once, but creeps up slowly, like a dark shape rising up from deep, murky water. What could possibly break a human being so completely? That they would actively choose a lifetime of silence. Over just telling the truth. And you know, as you sit there letting that question wash over you, I bet something else begins to surface. Something that isn't even about him. But about someone in your own life. Because the thing about stories like this is, they never just stay neatly contained in one room. They echo. They ripple outward. They move through time, silently, slipping under doorframes and finding their way into places you'd never expect them to reach. Maybe right now, you're thinking about your own father. Or your grandfather. Or an uncle who was always physically sitting in the armchair, but who never really felt present. The kind of man who sat at the dinner table with you every single night, passing the potatoes, cutting his meat, but rarely said more than a few words. A man who always listened way more than he ever spoke. Who nodded his head at all the right pauses in the conversation, who offered a tight-lipped smile when he was supposed to, but whose eyes always seemed to be focused on something 1,000 miles away. Somewhere far off. Like a crucial piece of him just never made the trip back. You start to remember the tiny details. Like the specific way he reacted to a sudden noise, a car backfiring, a door slamming shut in the wind. He didn't dive under the table. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't anything that would draw a crowd. It was just a slight, involuntary flinch in his jaw. A pause in his breathing that lasted just 1 second too long. You remember the way he always seemed to prefer the quiet over small talk. How the living room television would be droning on in the background, playing the evening news or a baseball game, but if you looked closely, you realized he wasn't actually watching the screen. How he would just sit in the dark sometimes on the back porch, not dozing off, just sitting there in the pitch black. Like he was waiting for a shoe to drop. Or, more likely, trying with all his might not to remember something. When you were a kid, you obviously didn't understand it. You just felt it. You felt that cold distance. You felt that heavy, invisible brick wall that nobody in the house ever openly acknowledged, but that every single family member subconsciously adjusted their behavior around. You learned pretty quickly not to ask him certain types of questions. And it wasn't because your mom pulled you aside and told you not to. It was because you could just sense, in your gut, that there were dark rooms inside of him that you weren't supposed to walk into. Conversations that were simply never going to happen. Then, as you got a bit older, you probably started trying to fill in the blanks yourself. You picked up dropped fragments of adult conversations. Hushed mentions of his time in the service or the war. You heard secondhand stories told by his friends or your aunts, but you never, ever heard them from his own mouth. And even when you heard those stories, they always felt hollow. Incomplete. Like the most important puzzle piece had been deliberately swept under the rug. And it had. The truth wasn't missing because he had a bad memory. It was buried because it had to be. Looking back now from where you stand today, you finally realized something that made zero sense when you were 10 years old. It wasn't that he didn't love you. It wasn't that he didn't care about your little league games or your school projects. It was simply that he had no earthly idea how to carry the sheer horror of what he had lived through, and still manage to be a fully present, light-hearted person in the suburban life he came back to. So, he chose the quiet. Not because keeping quiet was the easy way out, but because it was literally the only survival tactic he had left. And the tragedy is, that silence, it didn't just stay trapped inside his chest. It leaked out. It spread. It shaped the entire temperature and atmosphere of your childhood home. It dictated exactly how love was shown, or, more often, how it wasn't shown at all. That silence literally became the primary emotional language of your family tree. Clipped, short sentences. Carefully avoided topics at Thanksgiving. This heavy, unspoken agreement to just keep things surface level. And as the years rolled on, that suffocating silence just became your normal. It was expected. It was inherited, like a genetic trait. You might honestly even recognize bits of it in yourself right now. Think about those moments when you swallow your feelings, instead of just saying them out loud to your partner. Think about the way you sometimes freeze up and struggle to articulate why you're hurting. That knee-jerk instinct you have to downplay your own pain, to say, "I'm fine," because somewhere, deep in your bones, you were taught that some things are simply too heavy to burden other people with. That is exactly how it happens. It doesn't happen through big, explosive, cinematic events. It happens through thousands of days of quiet repetition. Through years and years of swallowing the one thing that desperately needs to be said. Through decades of hauling around a boulder, without ever allowing yourself to set it down for a rest. And when your mind wanders back to that fragile letter, to those 5 simple words, "I'll be home by Christmas," you finally get it. It wasn't just a line on a page. It was a snapshot of a moment in time. It was a snapshot of a younger version of him who still genuinely believed he was going to come out the other side in one piece. A kid who thought he could just step off a train and walk right back into a life totally untouched by the ugliness of the world. He thought that whatever nightmare he was walking into overseas, it would have the decency not to follow him back to his front door. But it didn't have that decency. It followed him. And the man who walked through the front door a year later, he wasn't the same kid who licked that envelope. So, the letter got shoved to the back of the drawer. And the ugly truth stayed locked tight behind his ribs. And the silence? The silence became the only inheritance he had left to give. Not because he wanted to leave you with a ghost. But because nobody ever handed him a map for any other way out. Maybe you're starting to see the whole picture a little more clearly now. This isn't just a story about an old soldier. It's a pattern. It's a quiet, devastating inheritance. One that slips down through the generations, not through loud arguments, but through empty spaces. Not in the campfire stories we tell, but in the truths we fiercely protect. And I think maybe the most heartbreaking part of the whole thing is this. These men, they didn't lack the capacity to love. They just completely lacked the vocabulary to explain their pain. And because they didn't have the words, they had to carry it completely alone. You know, there is always a very specific moment, right before a life fractures completely. It's never a loud moment. It's never dramatic. There's no ominous music swelling in the background. Nobody taps you on the shoulder to warn you. It's usually just a perfectly normal Tuesday morning, that has absolutely no idea it's about to turn into the hinge upon which the rest of a man's life swings. If you had been standing next to him on that specific day, you honestly wouldn't have noticed a single thing out of the ordinary. He was just a young guy in a uniform. A little sleep-deprived, maybe. Smelling of sweat and dirt. Maybe a little more withdrawn than the loudmouths in his unit. But mentally, he was still intact. Still whole. He was still a guy who firmly believed that whatever hell this war was, it had a finish line. And crossing that finish line meant going back to his own bed. But war has a funny way of working. It rarely breaks a person all at once. It chips away at them. In tiny, jagged fragments. Small, almost microscopic cracks in the foundation, things that don't even seem like a big deal when they happen. Until one random afternoon, the earth shifts just an inch. And absolutely nothing fits back together the way it did that morning. For him, it started with a completely standard assignment. Just another patrol on the schedule. The kind of routine sweep that had long ago started to blur together with the 50 patrols that came before it. The lieutenant barked the orders quickly. Nobody asked for the deeper reasoning, they were just passed down the chain. Move through the designated area. Clear the perimeter. Make sure it's secure for the next platoon. Just simple, sterile words. Efficient. Completely detached from human emotion. It's the kind of sanitized military language designed specifically to remove the human heart from the trigger finger. Because if you actually let yourself feel anything out there, doing the job becomes impossible. They rolled out just as the sun was coming up. The air that morning was thick. Heavy. It was quiet, but not the kind of quiet you hear in a forest. It was a tense, holding its breath kind of quiet. Heavy boots pressing down into the damp, muddy ground. Canvas gear and metal buckles softly clinking with every step they took. Nobody was talking. You learn pretty fast to shut your mouth on patrol. Because words have a nasty habit of making the situation feel real. And out there, reality is the absolute last thing you want to be thinking about. As the squad crept closer to the edge of the village, the hair on the back of his neck stood up. Something felt fundamentally off. It wasn't something obvious he could point his rifle at. It was just different. The air was way too still. No movement in the windows. No low hum of voices. No stray dogs, no smoke from cooking fires, none of the normal signs of life you'd expect to find in a place where people actually sleep. And let me tell you, that specific brand of dead silence, it doesn't bring you peace. It wraps a cold hand around your windpipe and squeezes. Because a silence that profound, it usually means the worst thing has already happened. Or, God forbid, it's just about to. The hand signal came down the line. Move in. Check every single structure. Top to bottom. You don't hesitate. You definitely don't pause to second-guess the captain. You just move. And so they did exactly what the drills had drilled into their muscle memory. What the commanders had ordered them to do. What they genuinely believed they had to do to make it to tomorrow. Wooden doors were kicked open. Shadowy rooms were swept with rifle barrels. Adrenaline-soaked eyes darting into every dark corner, looking for the thing that's trying to kill them. When your heart rate is pinned at 160 beats a minute, every single shadow looks like a man with a gun. Every rustle of wind, whether it's real or just the paranoia playing tricks, feels like an ambush waiting to spring. And when you exist inside that pressure cooker for months on end, your brain physically stops processing information clearly. You stop thinking entirely. You just react. Because taking a full second to think things through can put you in a body bag. Because the luxury of doubt is a great way to get your best friend shot. In a moment like that, philosophy goes out the window. You aren't weighing right against wrong. You are a cornered animal, thinking only about making it to the next breath. And then, something moved in the gloom. It was a flash. Fast. Small. Barely a blur in his peripheral vision. But when you're standing in a room where every nerve ending is screaming at you, a blur is all the reason you need. A sharp sound followed. It wasn't a loud crash. It didn't sound like an attack. It was just something falling. Something unexpected. And in that microscopic fraction of a second, long before his conscious brain could step in and hit the brakes, the choice was already made. It wasn't calculated. It wasn't malicious. It was pure, panicked instinct. Because that is the monstrous thing war demands from you. It demands that you pull the trigger first. And figure out what you aimed at later. But sometimes, the figuring out part, it arrives entirely too late. The tiny room suddenly erupted with a deafening crack. A violent, ear-splitting rupture that tore the silence right down the middle. And then, it went still again. But this stillness was different from the silence outside. This one was suffocating. It felt incredibly thick. It felt exactly like a massive, vital piece of the universe had just been violently ripped away, and the air in the room was rushing in to fill the void, but it just couldn't quite settle. He stood there, rooted to the dirt floor. Totally frozen. Just waiting for the ringing in his ears to fade, waiting for his rational mind to catch up and process the geometry of what had just occurred. And slowly, agonizingly, it did. But not in one big piece. The human brain is a funny thing. It tries to protect you from things that will break you. It drips the horror into your system piece by piece, so you don't drop dead from the shock of it all at once. He didn't look at the center of the room at first. He noticed the stupid, small details. A clay bowl, shattered on the packed earth floor. A shape crumpled against the far wall that didn't look like a sandbag. Something horribly out of place. And then, the cold realization started to pool in his stomach. It wasn't a crystal clear thought yet. It wasn't a fully formed sentence. It was just a primal, sickening dread. The feeling that something was wrong. Catastrophically wrong. And in that awful, suspended second, right before the unvarnished truth dragged itself up into the light, something deep inside his chest completely detached. Because even before your eyes confirm what you've done, your soul already feels the stain of it. He felt the crushing weight drop onto his shoulders. That cold, terrifying certainty that something permanent, something entirely irreversible, had just taken place by his own hand. And there wasn't a power on earth that could wind the clock back 10 seconds. This is the exact moment the secret takes root. It doesn't start with a clear, calm understanding of the facts. It doesn't start with a tearful confession to the chaplain. It starts with absolute, dizzying confusion. It starts with clinical shock. And it starts with a desperate, clinging silence that feels infinitely safer than speaking the reality out loud. Because there are some stories in this world that once you fully comprehend them, you simply cannot carry them the way you carry normal memories. And so, the brain steps in and does what it has to do to keep the heart beating. It splinters the memory. It shoves it behind a locked door. It shields you from the blast radius. Because to look straight at the explosion, to truly understand the math of what just happened, it would mean living through it a second time. And believe me, some moments in life are strictly not meant to be survived twice. But you know as well as I do, there is always a moment when the brain's defenses finally collapse. When it can't shield you anymore. When all those scattered fragments inevitably pull themselves together like magnets. When the pieces stop hiding in the dark corners of your mind, and they snap together to form the whole picture. A picture that is brutally undeniable. And right there, in that exact moment, that is where a person's spirit actually breaks. He didn't see it clearly at first. He actively fought against seeing it. Because having a clear vision in a room like that, it isn't a blessing. It is a curse. It's a life sentence. And his mind pushed back against that reality with every ounce of strength it had left. But you can only look away for so long. Eventually, the gap between the action, and the terrible consequence of the action, closes completely. He forced his eyes to look down at the floor. He really looked this time. Not through the sights of a rifle. Not as a soldier in a combat zone. Not as a guy just following orders from a radio. He looked down simply as a human being, desperately trying to make sense of the crumpled shape in front of his boots. And that is exactly when it hit him. The shape on the floor wasn't an enemy combatant. It wasn't an ambush. It wasn't a threat to his squad. It was just a child. Small. Incredibly small. And so still. Way too still. The unnatural, horrifying stillness that absolutely does not belong to a body that was breathing just 3 seconds ago. There are certain microscopic details from a trauma like that that get burned into your retinas. It's never the broad strokes. It's not the strategic explanation of the battle. It's the tiny, hyper-specific things that your brain takes a snapshot of, totally without your permission. The way a small hand looked, resting against the dirt. Fingers slightly uncurled. Looking exactly like it had just been reaching out to grab a dropped toy, or a scrap of food. A frayed piece of woven cloth. Something so painfully ordinary. A detail of domestic, everyday life that had absolutely no business being in the middle of a war zone. And the silence. Always that ringing silence. That crushing, suffocating quiet that instantly floods a room right after a mistake that can never, ever be fixed. Time didn't just slow down for him. It warped. Not in a cool, movie scene kind of way. It warped in a way that made the air feel like wet cement. It felt incredibly heavy. Like the universe was maliciously stretching out every single second, physically forcing his face into what he had done. And in that horrible, stretched out space, the reality of the situation finally arrived. It didn't tap on the door. It didn't ease its way in. It kicked the door off the hinges all at once. He knew. The confusion evaporated. There was no more, maybe it was a shadow. There was no magical way to twist the narrative and make it okay. And with that absolute, horrifying knowledge, the foundation of who he was simply gave way and collapsed. You wouldn't have known it to look at him. He didn't drop his weapon and scream at the sky. He didn't collapse against the wall in a weeping mess, not in any way his squad mates would notice. Because the reality of war is that it doesn't care if your soul just died. It doesn't give you a timeout to process your grief. It usually demands that you wipe your face, step directly over the trauma, and keep walking. It expects you to finish the patrol. It acts like the destruction of your entire moral compass doesn't warrant pausing the schedule. And so, unbelievably, he did just that. He picked up his feet and moved. He moved because the guy behind him was moving. Because the radio was still squawking orders. Because the physical world around him stubbornly refused to stop spinning, even though his internal world had just burned to the ground. But deep down inside the core of him, a load-bearing pillar was gone. Something bright and fundamental that he had carried inside his chest since he was a little boy, the thing that quietly told him he was a good person. It was just gone. Maybe it was his basic innocence. Maybe it was his trust in God. Or maybe it was just a naive assumption that he was strong enough to wade through hell and come out clean on the other side. Whatever you want to call it. It died on the dirt floor of that room. And the absolute worst part wasn't just the visual of what had happened. It was the cold, hard math of realizing there was no undo button. There was no alternate timeline he could jump to where this didn't happen. No amount of wishing, no amount of praying, was ever going to rewrite the past 10 seconds. He could never, ever go back to being the guy he was before he walked through that doorway. From that exact second onward, every single breath he took for the rest of his natural life would have to share space in his lungs with that memory. Every quiet cup of coffee on a Sunday morning. Every time he closed his eyes at night. Every desperate attempt to just be a normal guy again. He would have to drag this corpse along with him. And listen, this is where the real psychological break happens. It isn't in the pull of the trigger. It's in the 50 years that come after. Because now, this guy has to figure out how to wake up tomorrow. He has to go back to society and actually live. Not just survive in a trench. He has to live. And he has to do it while carrying a monster inside him that doesn't fit into any version of the man his wife or his mother knows. So, his subconscious makes a decision. He doesn't sit down and map this out. It's an emergency reflex. His mind takes the memory and locks it in a steel box. It doesn't make it disappear entirely, obviously. You can't delete it. But it muffles it just enough so he can remember how to tie his shoes. Just enough so he can hold down a job. Just enough so he doesn't walk into traffic to escape the sheer weight of it. And right there, that is the genesis of the silence. I'm not talking about the quiet of an empty room. I'm not talking about someone who's just shy. I'm talking about the radioactive silence of a human being who has seen something that defies human language. A man who has committed an act that he cannot, under any circumstances, reconcile with the reflection in his bathroom mirror. A man who fundamentally understands that if he ever opens his mouth and forms the words to tell the story would suddenly exist out loud. It would become real in the air between him and his family. And he knows he would not survive that reality. So, he clamps his jaw shut. Not because he's trying to be a tough guy. But because he physically cannot speak. Because there are some dark truths in this world. That once you invite them into the room, they don't just stay politely in the past. They sit on the couch next to you in the present. And for him, letting that truth sit on the couch was a luxury he couldn't afford if he wanted to keep his family together. So he just strapped it to his back and carried it. He didn't treat it like a story to be shared over beers. He didn't treat it like a memory to be processed in therapy. He treated it like a tumor. A quiet, heavy, malignant presence that shadowed him into every single birthday party, every anniversary, every quiet Tuesday that came after. And think back to the day he sat down and wrote that letter. I'll be home by Christmas. He had no idea. As his pen scratched across the paper, he had absolutely no idea that the hopeful kid writing those words was not going to be the man stepping off the train in December. Because the man who eventually walked up that driveway, his soul was already buried 1,000 miles away. When he finally did come home, everything looked exactly the way it was supposed to. And you know, that's always the very first thing that messes with a person's head. The bizarre normalcy of it all. The house was sitting right where he left it. The same chipped paint on the front steps. The same heavy oak front door that always swelled and stuck a little bit in the July heat. The same yellow kitchen where the mornings smelled like strong percolator coffee and eggs frying in a cast-iron skillet. Geographically, architecturally, not a single thing had shifted. And yet, to him, absolutely nothing felt the same. His family welcomed him the way families always do. Huge, tearful smiles. Wet cheeks. Arms wrapping around his neck so tightly, as if they believed that just hugging him hard enough could magically erase all the terrifying months he was gone. A dozen familiar voices all talking over each other in the living room. You're home. Thank God. I can't believe you made it back to us. We were sick with worry, you know. And he just stood there and nodded. He forced a smile when his mother smiled at him. He read off the script he knew they wanted to hear. I'm okay, Ma. I'm just a little jet-lagged. It's really, really good to be back. And look, maybe, in some deep, buried corner of his heart, a tiny fraction of him meant it. But the core of him, the part that actually dictates who a person is, that part didn't mean a word of it. Because the piece of his soul that had been standing in that dirt floor room, the piece that held the unvarnished truth of what really happened over there, it never caught the flight back. It was still trapped over there. Still standing over that terrible mistake. Still locked in that ringing silence. Still frantically trying to do the impossible math of a situation that would never make sense. The welcome home parties and the banners came down pretty fast. Not because his family stopped caring. But because the world doesn't stop spinning for anybody's trauma. The rent is still due on the 1st. The factory whistle still blows. All those mundane adult responsibilities were just waiting patiently in the wings, ready to drop right back onto his shoulders the second he took his boots off. And so, he just fell back into line. He dug his old civilian clothes out of the closet. He sat in his designated spot at the kitchen table. He walked down the same maple-lined sidewalks he walked down in high school. But everything he touched felt synthetic. Slightly off-center. Like he had accidentally wandered onto a movie set built to look like his life, and he was expected to play the role of a guy he didn't even recognize anymore. At first, it was just the little things. The way chatting with the neighbor over the fence felt like running a marathon. The way a joke would be told, and the laugh would bubble up in his throat, but it always arrived a full second behind everyone else's. Like his brain had to manually flip through a manual to remember how a normal guy reacts to a joke. Dinner times were exactly the same as before. The same chipped ceramic plates. The same meatloaf recipe. But something essential was completely gone. He would sit there at the head of the table, cutting his food, chewing slowly, hyper-aware of the mechanical motion of his jaw, but he wasn't actually tasting the salt or the pepper. He wasn't mentally in the dining room at all. Because his mind was thousands of miles away. It constantly drifted. Pulled back to that awful, quiet village. Over and over and over again, like a skipping record. It wasn't always a cinematic flashback where he'd hit the deck screaming. It was worse. It was a quiet, relentless haunting. A film loop playing behind his eyes that never quite reached the end credits. And the nights. God, the nights were the absolute worst. Because when the sun is up, you have noise to save you. You have the radio, the hum of traffic, a boss yelling, physical labor. Distractions. But at night. When the neighborhood shuts down. When the house gets that deep, settling quiet. That's when the ghosts come out to play. They don't kick the door down. They just seep through the floorboards. Persistent. Patient. A memory doesn't knock and ask if it's a good time to visit. It just invites itself into your bed. He would lie there for hours. Staring blankly at the cracks in the ceiling plaster. Listening to the rhythmic, hollow sound of his own breathing in the dark. Desperately trying to slow his heart rate down. Trying to anchor himself to the mattress, to the present year. But the past, it's like water. It always finds a crack to slip through. And once the dam breaks, there is absolutely no stopping the flood. He would squeeze his eyes shut. And boom, he was right back in that room. Not the whole narrative. Just the awful, jagged puzzle pieces. The visual of a small, motionless hand. The deafening silence after the shot. The exact millisecond where his entire life split into a before and an after. And every single time the reel played, it didn't get any lighter. It felt exactly as crushing. Exactly as terrifyingly real. Exactly as impossible to live with. So, he adapted. He learned a new set of survival skills. Not consciously. He didn't read a book on it. It was just an ugly, gradual evolution. He learned the fine art of evasion. He learned exactly how many hours of overtime he needed to pick up so he'd be too exhausted to dream. He learned how to steer a conversation away from anything deeper than the weather. He learned how to deflect a probing question with a joke. He became an absolute master at talking for 10 minutes straight, without ever actually revealing a single true thing about his soul. And as the years piled up, that coping mechanism simply became his personality. He stopped trying to confront the monster. He stopped trying to process the grief. He settled for just managing the symptoms. Functioning. Going through the motions. Biologically existing. If you looked at him from the sidewalk, you'd call it resilience. You'd call him a strong, stoic family man. He punched the clock. He paid the mortgage on time. He showed up to the parent-teacher conferences. He didn't wind up at the bottom of a bottle or sleeping on a park bench. But underneath the floorboards. The rot was spreading. The hollowness was growing. It wasn't tears streaming down his face sadness. It was way more dangerous than that. It was an emotional anesthetic. Total numbness. It was as if he reached into his own chest and dialed the volume of his humanity down to a 2, just to make sure the pain didn't blow the speakers out. But here's the catch: when you numb the bad stuff, you accidentally numb all the good stuff, too. The pure, unadulterated joy. The deep, spiritual connection with his wife. The ability to be completely, 100% present with his kids. He was occupying space in the house, but he was a ghost. He loved them, absolutely, but he loved them from behind bulletproof glass. He was breathing, but he wasn't really living. And don't think for a second the people in that house didn't feel it. They couldn't put a name to it. They couldn't articulate the psychology of it. But they felt the chill in the air. They felt the million-mile stare. They felt that thick, invisible sheet of plexiglass between them that no amount of affection could shatter. Eventually, they just learned to navigate around it like a piece of furniture. To accept that this was just how Dad is. To swallow their own desire for closeness and stop asking him to open up. And slowly, like a fog rolling in off the harbor. Without a single person ever holding a family meeting to agree upon it. The silence took over. It wasn't just his personal armor anymore. It became the wallpaper of the house. It seeped into the marriage bed. It sat on the sofa. It became the very oxygen the entire family breathed. Because the war didn't just follow him home on an airplane. It embedded itself inside his marrow. And it didn't matter what zip code he moved to. He was always carrying the battlefield with him. Think about it. Silence like that doesn't just stay neatly boxed up in one person's head. It refuses to stay contained. It doesn't belong exclusively to the man who brought it home. It moves. It drifts, quietly. Subtly, like a draft under the door. From his compromised life, straight into the veins of the people around him. At first, honestly, it doesn't even look like trauma. It just looks like completely mundane, everyday moments. A car ride with Dad where the radio is off and nobody says a word. A question a kid desperately wants to ask about the past, but the words die in their throat. A heavy, complicated emotion that gets swallowed instead of shared over the dinner table. But you let those tiny moments stack up over 5, 10, 15 years. They solidify into hard patterns. And those patterns, they eventually forge an entire personality. If you were a fly on the wall, watching his kid grow up in that house, you wouldn't immediately flag it as a broken home. You really wouldn't. There were no plates being thrown at the walls. No screaming matches in the front yard. No glaring red flags waving in the breeze. But if you paid attention, you'd notice the void. The massive crater where emotional intimacy was supposed to be. Something crucial was missing. Something incredibly hard to put your finger on. Much less explain to a guidance counselor. Picture the kids sitting there at the kitchen table, kicking their feet. Staring at the side of their dad's face. Just waiting. Hoping for a crumb of something real. A story about when he was young. A moment of genuine, messy connection. A second where the armor cracks and the real guy peeks out. But the crack never came. Instead, the kid got one-word answers. Yep. Nope. Maybe. A vague nod over the top of the newspaper. A deafening silence right in the exact space where a father's reassurance was supposed to live. And here's the thing about children, their little radar dishes are always spinning. They absorb everything. Even when their brains aren't developed enough to process the complexities of PTSD. They absolutely feel the emotional blackout. They physically feel the empty space where a parent's vulnerability is supposed to sit. And because they don't have a degree in psychology to understand it, their little brains try to solve the puzzle. And they solve it the only way a child's egocentric brain can. By blaming themselves. He's quiet because I talked too loud. He's miles away because I'm just not that interesting. I guess this coldness is just what grown-up love feels like. And man, that is exactly where the infection starts. Not with someone intentionally trying to break a kid's heart. Not with malice or cruelty. But with a tragic, unavoidable misunderstanding of a broken man's silence. The kid grows up, day by day, constantly recalibrating their personality to survive in that icy environment. They become an expert at tiptoeing through the emotional minefield. They learn exactly how to smooth over uncomfortable moments. They learn to keep their own problems small, light, and easy to digest. They learn to never, ever push for deeper emotional truth. Because in that house, pushing for truth, results in that terrifying, dead-eyed silence. And to a kid, that kind of silence feels exactly like being abandoned. So, what do? They stop asking. They contort themselves to fit the mold. They shove their own big feelings down into a box. And over a couple of decades, that defensive crouch just becomes their natural posture in the world. Fast forward. The calendar flips. That little kid in the kitchen is suddenly 40 years old. They have a mortgage. A career. Maybe they have a spouse and a couple of kids of their own sitting at their own kitchen table. And completely unaware that they're doing it. They unpack those exact same inherited patterns right in their own living room. It might not look exactly identical to their father's trauma. But the rhythm is the same. The melody is familiar. It's the ghostly echo of a war they never fought. It shows up in those frustrating arguments with their spouse, where they just shut down and walk away instead of fighting for the connection. It shows up in their total inability to be vulnerable when they're terrified. It shows up when they automatically choose the safety of silence, even when their partner is begging them to just speak from the heart. And if you ask them in therapy why they do it, they wouldn't have a clue. Because the root cause of this behavior was never actually discussed out loud. Nobody ever sat them down and explained the mechanics of the family curse. It was just inhaled from the atmosphere. Absorbed through the drywall. Handed down like an heirloom clock. Listen, this is the brutal reality of how generational trauma actually travels. It doesn't always hitch a ride on the horrific stories we tell at the bar. More often than not, it travels on the back of nothing. Through the blank spaces. Through the tears that were swallowed. Through the hugs that ended a few seconds too soon. And if you're really honest with yourself, if you take a hard look in the mirror, I'd bet money you can spot fragments of this dynamic in your own life. Think about the times you've sat in your car in the driveway, completely overwhelmed, but you paste a smile on before you walk through the front door. Think about the moments you actively choose to swallow your truth, even when the words are literally burning the back of your throat. Think about how exhausting it is to try and explain a sadness that feels way too big, way too muddy, and way too ancient to put into a text message. Those instincts. They didn't just spontaneously generate inside of you. They were planted. They came from somewhere. From someone else's broken heart. From a series of tragic events that played out decades before you even took your first breath. And that is precisely what makes this brand of inherited pain so incredibly stubborn to heal. It doesn't arrive in your lap with a sticky note explaining where it came from. It doesn't introduce itself. It just sets up shop in your nervous system. Quietly dictating the terms of your life. Drawing invisible fences around how deeply you're willing to connect with people. Putting a ceiling on how much joy you allow yourself to feel. Tricking you into believing that biting your tongue is somehow a virtue. And every single bit of it. Every wall, every hesitation, every swallowed tear. Leads a straight line right back. Back to a young man sitting on the edge of a bed in a terrifyingly quiet room. Rolling an unsent letter between his fingers. Carrying a ghost he refused to introduce to his family. Genuinely believing that letting the silence slowly eat him alive was a noble sacrifice. But the tragic flaw in his plan is that silence, doesn't actually burn the story down. It preserves it in amber. It hands the baton to the next runner, passing the heavy, invisible weight from the father, to the son, to the daughter. Until one day, somebody on the family tree finally digs their heels in and says, enough. Someone who has the courage to pull it out of the dark, to look it dead in the eye, and to decide that they are going to do the terrifying work of understanding it, to give it a name, and maybe, just maybe, to take a sledgehammer to the cycle. Because you can't undo the original trauma. It happened. It echoes off the canyon walls forever. But echoes, if you don't feed them, they do eventually fade out. But that only happens if someone in the bloodline is finally brave enough to stop talking, and listen closely enough to hear the screams that were trapped inside the silence. It never happens with fireworks, you know. There's rarely a dramatic movie scene where the heavens open up and suddenly everything makes perfect, crystal clear sense. Real life doesn't work like that. It begins quietly, softly. The exact same way most life-altering things do. Picture the house now. It's still. It's not abandoned, there's still furniture, still life, but the energy is fundamentally different now. It's a whole lot quieter than it was when you were a kid. But it's no longer that thick, suffocating, walking on eggshells kind of quiet. It's the hollow, exhausted quiet that settles in after the fight is finally over, after all the words have been spoken, or permanently buried in the ground. A lot of time has vanished. Years turned into decades before you even noticed. And now, the man who served as the vault for all that suffocating silence, he's gone. Passed on. There was no deathbed confession. He didn't pull you close and hand you the missing pieces of the puzzle. There was no cathartic afternoon where he poured 2 coffees and finally unburdened his soul. He just left, leaving behind an absence in the living room that somehow feels 10 times heavier than his actual physical presence ever did. And then, one random Saturday, while you're sorting through the remnants of a life in that same house, inside that same swollen, sticky drawer, you find the letter. It's not like you're on a treasure hunt unearthing a scandalous secret. It's more like you've just stumbled upon something that had been sitting in the dark, patiently waiting. Biding its time. Waiting for the exact right moment for someone with fresh eyes to finally look at it. When you first hold it, it really doesn't look like much of a big deal. It's just a brittle, stained piece of stationery buried under a pile of old tax returns and warranty manuals. Something you could easily toss into a black garbage bag without a second thought. But your gut tells you to stop. There's a strange gravity to it. You notice the deliberate way it was hidden away. You notice the incredibly sharp, intentional folds in the paper. The sheer fact that in 40 years of spring cleanings, it never once made it to the trash can. That fact alone screams that this piece of paper mattered. And so, sitting on the edge of the bed, you open it. You do it carefully. Tentatively. Almost like you're handling a live wire. It's instinctual, you treat it with a weird reverence. Because even though you don't know what's inside yet, your bones know that this isn't just a note reminding someone to buy milk. This is an artifact. The dry paper resists your fingers a little bit. Decades of sitting in a humid drawer have made it incredibly fragile. Decades of being a secret have made it feel almost sacred. And when the flap finally gives way and you unfold it, there they are. So agonizingly simple. So utterly uncomplicated. I'll be home by Christmas. That's literally it. He didn't write an essay. He didn't offer a dramatic confession. There are no details about the mud, or the gunfire, or what happened after he licked the stamp. It's just a desperate, naive promise, perfectly flash-frozen in time. But the second you read it, the entire landscape of your childhood shifts. Everything feels completely different. Because in the blink of an eye, that massive, invisible wall of silence that ruined so many dinners, it suddenly has a shape. That cold, unapproachable absence of a father, suddenly has a profound, heartbreaking meaning. Look, you still don't have all the facts. You don't know the specifics of the village or the dirt floor. Not yet. Maybe not ever. But you don't need the facts to feel the truth of it. You feel the crushing gravity in your hands. You feel the immense, suffocating grief radiating out from behind those 5 simple words. And something inside your own chest clicks into place. It's not fireworks. It's a quiet unlocking. Because for the very first time in half a century, that agonizing memory is no longer trapped inside the mind of one lonely guy. He has officially passed the burden on to you. Not as a curse to ruin your life, but as a truth to be acknowledged. So, you read the line again. Slower this time. Letting the ink sink into your brain. Paying just as much attention to the massive expanse of blank, white paper below the sentence as you do to the words themselves. And maybe, despite yourself, you feel a lump form in your throat. It's not because the sentence, "I'll be home by Christmas," is particularly poetic. It's because of the absolute mountain of things he left off the page. It's the devastating realization of all the laughter, the intimacy, the peace of mind that never made it out of that jungle. All the versions of him that died right alongside that unwritten narrative. And sitting there on his old bed, the knot in your chest finally starts to loosen. Not all the way. A lifetime of defense mechanisms doesn't vanish in an afternoon. But it loosens just enough. Just enough to take the sharp edges off a resentment you've been carrying around since you were a teenager. You stand up, holding the letter, and you walk outside. You don't do it because you read somewhere that it's a good closure ritual. You aren't putting on a show for anyone. You do it because your body just instinctively knows the air inside the house is too stale for what needs to happen next. You find a quiet spot in the backyard. Somewhere still. Somewhere open to the sky. And you just set it down on the patio table. Or maybe on the stone wall. You don't throw it in the trash. You don't shove it deep in your own pocket to hide away for another 40 years. You just offer it up. Back to the universe. Like you're returning a stolen item that was never supposed to be locked in a dark drawer to begin with. A gentle breeze rolls through the yard. It flutters the corner of the yellowed paper. It doesn't blow it away into the neighbor's yard. It just ruffles it. Like the world is finally nodding its head and acknowledging the pain it caused him. And standing there, looking at it, you realize that the long, emotional goodbye that your family was robbed of is actually happening right now. There are no speeches. There are no dramatic tears or screaming. It's just a profound, settling release in your bones. A release that doesn't require you to have all the answers or know exactly what happened over there. It just requires you to take off your blinders, look at the bloody wound that was hidden for so long. And finally allow it to exist in the daylight. Because let me tell you, some truths don't come out until it's far too late to fix the damage. But they still fundamentally matter. And sometimes, just sometimes, the simple, quiet act of being a witness to someone else's secret agony is the only medicine required to finally start letting it go. There are millions of stories exactly like this one playing out right under our noses. So many unsent letters. So many deafening silences sitting at kitchen tables across the country. So many perfectly normal-looking lives that have been entirely bent out of shape by a single, unspoken moment in time. Honestly, think about it. If you walk into almost any older house on your street, if you know exactly which drawer to pull, if you look past the junk and pay close attention to what a person chose not to throw away, you'd probably uncover the exact same kind of ghost. A faded Polaroid. A cryptic note on the back of a receipt. Some mundane, worthless little trinket that is secretly acting as the anchor for an ocean of unresolved grief. Because the real history of the world, it doesn't live in the textbooks we read in high school. It lives in the nervous systems of ordinary people. It lives in the heavy backpacks they drag to work every day. It lives in the secrets they swallow over morning coffee. And it echoes endlessly in the negative space, the places where warmth and connection were supposed to be, but just weren't. There are tens of thousands of guys, exactly like the man in this story. Men who survived the worst things imaginable and physically came back. Who managed to put on a suit, build a career, mow the lawn, and raise a couple of kids. They checked every single box society asked them to check. And yet, they spent their entire adult lives hauling around a lead weight that their wives and children never even knew existed. A terror that was never validated. A guilt that was never, ever put into words. And it wasn't because the people in their lives were cold or didn't want to help them carry it. It was simply because the English language doesn't have the vocabulary to adequately describe the total destruction of a human soul. So, they just locked their jaws. And unfortunately, that clamped jaw, that became the primary inheritance they left for their kids. They didn't do it on purpose. No father sets out to pass his nightmares onto his daughter. It wasn't a malicious choice. It was just the raw, ugly byproduct of a man doing the only thing he knew how to do to keep from blowing his brains out. And so, here we are today, holding the bag. Sitting with that legacy. It's not always obvious. It doesn't usually look like a panic attack. But it's right there in the room with us. It's in the way we clam up when a conversation gets too real. It's in the way we second-guess our own right to take up emotional space in a relationship. It's in that frustrating, paralyzing feeling of knowing you are profoundly sad about something, but having absolutely no idea how to explain why to the person sitting next to you. This is the real inheritance. Not the silver watches or the real estate. It's the anxious attachment. The learned avoidance. The gaping holes in the family narrative. And I think, this is exactly where a story like this stops being just a sad historical anecdote. Because whether you asked for it or not, you are an active participant in this story now. You aren't the guy who pulled the trigger in the village. You didn't live through the nightmare. But you are the person holding the pen right now. You are the one with the rare ability to step back and look at the blueprint of the house you grew up in. To finally recognize the dry rot for what it is. To feel the weight of it in your own hands. And, crucially, you have the power to make a different choice than the guys who came before you. Maybe breaking the curse is as ridiculously simple as finally turning to your dad and asking the scary question that everyone else in the family agreed to ignore. Or maybe it's just sitting next to a friend who is hurting, and shutting your mouth, completely eliminating the pressure to fix them, and just giving them a safe, quiet room to fall apart in. Or hell, maybe it's just looking in the mirror and finally admitting to yourself that the void you've been feeling your whole life isn't a defect in your personality. Admitting that the emotional distance you grew up with meant something. That it wasn't a lack of love, but a symptom of a very real, very hidden battle. Because the ugly truth of it all is this. The absolute most tragic part of these men's lives isn't the horror they endured on the battlefield. It's the fact that they were convinced they had to carry the rot of it. Completely, utterly alone. And if we just shrug our shoulders and leave it at that. If we let these unsent letters and unspoken stories stay buried in the backs of dusty dressers. Unread. Unacknowledged. Then the silence wins. The cycle just restarts with the next generation. But if we make a conscious, terrifying choice. Even in tiny, awkward, imperfect ways. To actually listen to the people we love. To ask the invasive questions. To pry open the sticky drawers of our own family histories. And read the painful truths left behind. Then the whole trajectory changes. You can't go back in a time machine and fix the past. The trauma happened. But you get total control over how much power it has over tomorrow. Because true remembrance, the kind that actually matters, isn't just about saluting a flag or pouring one out for the dead. It's about stubbornly refusing to let their quiet agony disappear into the void without a witness. So, do me a favor. Tonight. Or maybe on your drive to work tomorrow. Or the very next time you find yourself frustrated by a family member who just can't seem to open up and connect. Just pause. Take a deep breath. And try to imagine the invisible backpack they might be wearing. Imagine the terrifying things they might be desperate to get off their chest, but literally cannot find the words to say. And if you can manage to quiet your own ego for just a few minutes. If you just sit in that uncomfortable space with them. I promise you, you'll start to hear it. It won't be a clear sentence. It won't be a neat, tidy confession. But you'll feel the hum of it. An echo. A vibration. A heavy, aching presence sitting right there on the couch between you. And when you finally feel it, please, whatever you do, don't run away from it. Don't change the subject to the weather. Because that uncomfortable, heavy silence. That is exactly where the deepest parts of their story are still desperately fighting to survive. Waiting patiently. Not for you to offer advice. Not for you to fix it. But simply to finally be seen.